Welcome to Collision, the podcast where we discuss the fun and sometimes complicated collision of real life and trusting God. If you're curious or confused about how to engage the world we live in, we hope our conversation here helps. Now, let's get into this episode of Collision.
All right. Well, hey, welcome to this episode of Collision. It's so great to be with you. And today is a spicy one. I got to be honest with you. We're going to be talking about sex, which is a sermon series that we're walking through as a church right now. And let's face it, it's a hot subject, Matt.
It totally is. Before we get to all of our conversation on sex today, it is baseball season.
Yes.
And yesterday, your Colorado Rockies went 10 games below 500 before the first month of the season. My question to you is, are they going to lose 100 games this year?
Oh, yeah. Man, it is not looking good, is it?
It's not.
It's rough. I mean, as a Giants fan at my core, though, it means that the 3 times the Giants come to town, tickets will be pretty easy to get.
That's true. That's true. They had their lowest attendance in 20 years yesterday.
Oh,
Pretty crazy. So
rough.
yeah, that was my soft opening into the topic that we have to talk about today. So yeah, like you said, today we are talking about sex, and we're doing this series called Sex Talk at church, where all three, you, me, and Chris, are each taking a series and talking about that. And so today, really, we just wanted to bring that to the podcast, where we're just going to talk openly about some of the issues of sex, and particularly what we as pastors get asked in different settings when it comes to sex. One of the things I've learned is that there is, what's the right word? There's no hesitancy about people to ask questions to pastors, even on the issues of sex.
Yeah, no doubt about it. No doubt about it.
Yeah. So, just in terms of us getting started here, what was like the earliest memory for you of sexual awareness? Like when you were a kid, like what was that? What was that for you?
Yeah, so I think the earliest one that I can remember of just being attracted to a girl was when I saw Grease for the first time, and I saw the great Olivia Newton-John. And I don't know if I said it or if I just thought it, but she could have been Mrs. Johnson. Yes.
At that moment, all the planets aligned.
It did. I mean, little, 4-year-old me, or I don't know how old I was, but she did it for me. But really, the sexual awareness beyond just attraction was probably in late middle school when one of my buddies found one of his dad's Playboys and called us all to his house, and it was like this taboo thing that you were like, I mean, man, it was exciting, but it was also like this vortex of like kind of leaning into something that, as a kid, it's like this is bad, but I kind of can't get away from it. Like the opportunity to like flip the pages and see things that I've never seen before.
Yeah. How old were you when that happened? Just out of curiosity.
Gosh, I was probably 8.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really young.
Yeah, that's what's interesting about that is, most kids experience pornography before their 10th birthday in the U.S. now. And so, yeah, you weren't too far off. You were ahead of your time, James.
There you go.
There you go. For me, my earliest moments of like attraction was in the 4th grade, and there was this girl in class, and she came walking in, and we had been in elementary school our entire lives together, so it wasn't like she was new to me or anything. But there was this awakening inside of me, right? Of like, wow, like look at her, and we joked beforehand of that I would point to that really as like my first crush, and this awakening that girls existed, and that there was an attraction there to girls and so on and so forth. So that was my 4th grade year, and then walking through, one of the great things that one of the things I'm really thankful for, is that, my family was a family of faith growing up. And so my dad never had any of that stuff around or and let us into any of that. And so it probably wasn't really till my later middle school years when a buddy brought, a Playboy or something like that to school, actually. And, we were all huddled around the playground, which was like the dumbest thing ever, right? Looking at this. And because the teacher's like, hey, what are all these boys huddled around here? And that experience soon ended quickly. And so, but those are my first memories of that. One of the things as we really started off this sermon series with was the question, like, when it comes to the way that our culture handles sex, is it making life better or more complicated?
Yeah.
And as you look at that from like your perspective, you have 2 kids that are out of the home now. My kids are, high school, middle school, and elementary school. And, the cultural or the sexual revolution has happened in our culture. And so there is a very specific way of the way that culture handles sex, which we've really called like the Tinder generation, as you and I have talked of this idea of like free sex anytime you want it, travel wherever you can to find it kind of idea. And, as you process that question, as you look at culture, has it really made life better or just maybe more complicated?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think it's made it more complicated, and not necessarily just because of my Christian faith, because of initiating conversations before my kids or my wife and I were actually ready to. Like my kids were both born in Tennessee, and we quickly moved to Seattle, Washington, and our daughter's first day at kindergarten, and she came home, and we were like, how was it? Who did you meet? What did you learn? And she said, did you know that some boys marry boys and some girls marry girls? And it was like, how did, and that's what she left her first day of kindergarten with an awareness of. And it was one of those things like, man, that's not really, like, educationally, that's not really where we wanted her to start. And we weren't ready for that conversation. And I think, I mean, again, even outside of my Christian faith, I think some of those conversations, like, they're being initiated by our culture into our kids' lives at such a rate and in such a emphatic way that as a parent, it's really hard, because I feel like parents are kind of running offense or a defense against a worldview that is being fed to them from the culture and the schools and everyone first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I look at it and, outside of the examples that I used in the sermon, one of the articles that I read is I really enjoy like BuzzFeed articles, because it's like, here's the top 20 things or here's the top 10 things. And I find them humorous. And one of them was the top 20 difficult conversations or awkward conversations that you've had with someone you were dating. And 4 or 5 of them, so like 25% of the list, was around people who had awkward conversations around what's now in our culture called body count, right? The number of people that you've slept with. And here were people who were, probably not of faith, speaking to the awkwardness of it and the lies that are told either, from guys to make it look like they've slept with more, or, the embarrassment of how many they have slept with when, this was a person, one girl was talking about how she had met a person that she had really liked and that she was, they were walking towards engagement and they had moved in together and all this kind of stuff. And the awkward conversation when she realized, when the conversation came up about how many people that she had slept with, and she was torn, even as a person not of faith, torn between like, this is a guy that I want to give myself my all to, and yet we're having this conversation about the sexual experience that we've shared outside of knowing each other. And so that was interesting. I just sat back and I just thought, man, like, it really has made life complicated. And I can identify when you say like just the parenting stuff. The age of innocence is totally lost on our kids. And because of, culture and specifically the porn industry of, like I mentioned earlier, when they're targeting kids, so we decided, hey, we're going to have our conversations before the fourth grade, before they go into their fourth grade year, and trying to navigate that conversation in a healthy way. And then it became so real for us because after we had that conversation with my oldest, the very next day he went to school. And during that day, there was a girl who was being accused in the fourth grade of sleeping around by another boy in the class. And so all of the fourth grade was talking about this and, totally putting this girl, fourth grade girl, 11-year-old girl, in this position that was not true about her, in this position. And all of a sudden that came home, and it was like we had to have, even more conversation about what that looked like and, what does it look like as a young man to honor women and so on and so forth. And it was like, man, I'm having this with my 11-year-old, my 10-year-old, right? It's just those things that even as parents that we look at and man, so yeah, absolutely. From my vantage point, it has absolutely made life way more complicated.
Well, and it forces our kids to process things that they don't understand. I mean, I've heard stories from friends of their kids at school and other kids based on their interest or how they look, saying, "You're gay, you just don't know it yet."
Yeah.
And it's like, I just don't like girls because they don't throw the ball as hard as the guys do, right? It could be as innocent as that, or girls have cooties, but where they're throwing language around and they're actually putting extra pressure and burden because now this 10-year-old boy has to actually defend that or process. I wonder if I am gay because this group of people are telling me that because the way I dress or my interests, and so it's just not necessary. It's like don't awaken that until you're developmentally ready to lean into it.
Yeah. And so, as I've watched culture through the years go down this path and this freedom of expression when it comes to our sexuality, and then the way that the church has handled it, which is almost the opposite, right? The more free our culture has become, the more prudish the church has become when it comes to sex and even talking about sex. Our listeners would be surprised at how many people mentioned how inappropriate it was for us to be doing a series of sex in church on Sunday morning. This is just not appropriate. When the reality is that, so much of Scripture actually speaks to our sexuality, the way that God created sex, the goodness of sex in our lives. And so you and I have both had plenty of opportunity through our lives as pastors to be in settings where we not only got to talk about sex and teach on sex, but also where ultimately those conversations end up is in people asking questions about the pastor in terms of the moralness, I guess, or what we would have to say about certain issues. And so we thought today, in light of the sermon series that we're doing, that maybe we just go through some of the common asked questions of us when it comes to sex. And so all of these questions have been actually legitimately asked of you and me. And sometimes in cultural or in counseling sessions, other times just when people run into us at the grocery store. But people come to their pastors and they ask of these things. And so we thought we would just run through them. And so the first question, and probably the question that's most asked of pastors, is this one. When it comes to singles, whether you are an adult single, whether you're in your teenage years, how far is okay to go? How far is it to go before marriage? How far can you take the sexual experience before marriage? And so how would you begin that, James? How would you answer that question?
Yeah, and I've been answering that forever because I started out as a youth pastor. So every year we would have a series on dating and sex, and at the end of it, all the kids wanted to know was which base can I get to and still be okay with God,
and which is funny because you told me earlier that you did that sex series intentionally about this time every year, when it was like the kids were getting a little squirrely, and springtime's happening and all this kind of stuff. It was like, we need something to liven this all up.
Totally, exactly, and yep, it always draws a crowd, and there's scriptures, and there's purity before God. There's Romans 12, which talks about offering your body to God as an act of worship. There's all those avenues. Honestly, where I tended to go was I would encourage students to really question and develop their value system for the young man or young woman that they wanted to be. But like think down the road to the man or woman that you marry, and who do you want to be on that day? And then just work backwards from that. So I would really put the pressure back on them. And the reality is, teenagers always want to push things as far as they can. But it was really interesting when you frame it like that. A lot of them really wanted to hold on to purity and wanted to preserve themselves for someone else, which always led to me encouraging them. So you have to come up with that boundary for yourself. And then the hard encouragement was, as you date a boy or a girl, you need to have a conversation, not on the couch after your parents went to bed, but you need to have a conversation about kind of what the nature of your relationship is and really what your boundaries are. Like this is what I'm comfortable with, and as we date, I would just ask you to respect that and respect me in the midst of that. And the clarity of that would always lead to, if a boy pushed past that, or if a girl was trying to lure you beyond where you said you wanted to go, it shows clearly what their intentions were always. So yeah.
That's really good. Yeah, having grown up in the church, this was, when the sex series jumped in, this was always the question. And I had a youth leader who once used Colossians 2:21, which says, "Do not handle, do not taste, do not touch." And he set that as the boundary. And you can go back and read Colossians chapter 2, but that is not what it's about. It's not about sex at all. It's about actually the spiritual world. And so, I think through the years, I think your answer is so good. And what I'm finding actually is that question isn't just asked among teenagers anymore. We are a church, and we have a significant segment of people who come to Crossroads who are in their 30s, and this is a question among singles of how far is too far. And I think that the way that I would put it out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is that we are to stay away in our singleness from anything that stirs sexual desire in us to sin. I think that's what 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 is about. And so what I give people advice to is not to create a desire, and don't put yourself in a position where you cannot rightly or righteously meet a desire. And so if you put yourself in a situation and sexual desire is awakened in you, is aroused in you, and you have no way that you can rightfully or righteously take care of that, then you've probably crossed the line. Yeah. And then I think your advice is so great. What is it on your wedding day? What do you want the story of your life to be? What are you giving yourself to when you're sitting there saying I do? And whatever you want the picture of that to be, work backwards. And I would say, to those who maybe have crossed the lines of purity and wherever you might be, that it's not too late to start that. That you can make, you can draw that up now. What do you want your story to be like? And you can work backwards, no matter what age you are in that. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, even in my experience, I mean, when my wife and I were dating, and I'd go to her house and we'd watch a movie, and it's dark, and there's always the temptation, and I remember talking to a pastor buddy and said, "Man, it's it's really hard to stay pure in the midst of all this. And he said, then say goodbye at the door, right? Like don't go sit on the couch if that setting is, I mean, like you put yourself in the situation that tests the limits. And it really helped me just think in my own discipline of, take a step back, right? I mean, like, kind of the old adage, like, don't go grocery shopping hungry, right? Like,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And sexually speaking, that plays into that too, right? I mean, like, there's nothing really sexy about saying goodbye at the front door, but man, the couch in the dark is a different story.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. So the second question that we get asked quite a bit as pastors is, for years, Christians really have been taught in, opposite of the free love of culture, is that sex is bad, right? That sex is dirty. The church is in large part taught that, we're to be prudish, when it comes to our sexuality, which is not actually what the Bible has to teach at all when it comes to sex. The Bible has to teach that sex is powerful, right? And that it's good because of the God who made it. And we're to control, we're to put it in the context of which God has, which is what he says is in marriage. And so the question that we've been asked is how do I retrain myself to realize that sex is actually good? When all of church, when all of my life has been taught, if I wanted to be a Christian, that I had to view sex as bad, and then all of a sudden I get married, right? And it's like, that switch isn't just a switch that gets turned on. Like something just doesn't go from bad to good. It's always good. The way that we handle it can be good or evil, right? And so what would you say? What would that look like for someone who's been taught their entire lives that sex is bad? Now they find themselves in marriage and they're trying to retrain their mind to see sex the way that God has seen it.
Yeah. So for me in those settings, I really encourage people back to Genesis 2 and back to before the fall when Adam and Eve sinned. And the very first thing they do, as we know, is they covered themselves up, right? They hid themselves from each other relationally, emotionally, and physically. But before that, in Genesis 2, it said they were naked and unashamed. I mean, I think of a honeymoon, right? And clothes are kind of optional, and it's this beautiful freedom. And I think in that recapturing and letting ourselves understand that in marriage, God gives us Genesis 2 back. He gives us back. In this relationship between one man and one woman, he gives you that playground back, that ability to explore and to be satisfied and to learn how to serve each other in sexual ways. And so I think the weight of Genesis 3 and the shame is so heavy on us that in those conversations for me, I push it back to Genesis 2 and a reminder of the privilege that we have in marriage to regain and experience anew what God created us for.
Yeah. Passage in Genesis chapter 2 is so interesting, right? Because it's such a weird verse that they were naked and not ashamed. And really, it's like speaking to the intimacy that every single one of us desires as humans, right? That we want to be fully loved, we want to be fully known, right? And we want to walk without the fear of rejection. And because of Genesis chapter 3, that all of a sudden the possibility of rejection is in, right? So I'm not going to actually let myself be fully known to you. Therefore, I'll never be fully loved. And all of a sudden, when we get into marriage, it's like there's this relationship, like a mirror that we look into, right? Where all of a sudden it's really hard to hide skeletons in closets. Eventually they fall out, and God sets up this beautiful covenant between two people to experience intimacy in this world in very unique ways. And it's a very beautiful picture. I usually ask or tell people to turn to Song of Solomon and to go through that and to really like try to understand that and even memorize some of the passages in Song of Solomon, because it is such a unique religious writing, and it's very unique in the Old Testament. Of really, it's an extended love song, right? It's a euphoric love song between a husband and a wife, and their sexual experience, and the way the terms are used in there, the things that are being described in there, the sexual acts that are being described in there are all set in a way of beauty and goodness
Yeah.
to be experienced between a man and a woman. And so I would just tell somebody, if you're struggling to see sex is good, spend some time in Genesis chapter 2, spend some time in the Song of Solomon, and really try to understand the way that God sees the world when it comes to our sexuality. Let's do a third question. You ready for number 3?
Heck yeah.
All right. This is always a fun one. This oftentimes, I think, happens to me in marriage counseling, as when this conversation comes up. But how often should married couples have sex? So I had a mentor once who said, like, try weekly, as in TRI, like 3 times a week, and then he said, or try weekly, as in TRY, like try once a week, or try weekly, as in I'm not very strong, I'll weekly come to this place. I also have heard it said, and I think this is actually really good advice, is that it's hard to actually recommend how much a certain couple should have sex, but the question that is asked, or that I asked back, is how many times do you go to the grocery store? Enough to be fed, enough to feel like you've been fed. And so what does that look like in a married couple? Hard to describe, hard to give a number, but what does it look like for you to actually walk in satisfaction? So how would you maybe speak to that?
So I typically ask the couple, how often do you think about sex?
Mm.
And it's interesting because the guy's like, morning, afternoon, evening, right? A lot of times. And then his spouse, or it's flip-flopped. And
Yeah.
she'll say, or he'll say, like, maybe once a month. And it's like, and you see the chasm in
Yeah.
how often it even crosses their mind. And then you see where the disappointment is in that, right?
Mm.
And just and there's nothing wrong with either of those. I mean, it's just
Right.
how they're wired. And but I think starting with how often do you think about sex leads to an open, healthy conversation about how often we could have sex, and even what's the fruit of that? Like, do we feel closer after that? And because at the end, I think that's what both the husband and the wife long for.
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of takes us to the last question, which is, what does it look like to cultivate intimacy in marriage? And so, very rarely are couples, people who come together as a married couple, do they experience the same sex drive, right? Does the number of times, that sex should happen, those very rarely are ever like one for one in that. And so you have this idea of intimacy, and what does it look like for a couple to come together? And this question is so important because when we look at sex, we know that it's commanded by God, right? Genesis chapter 1, right? Or the very first page of the Bible, that God actually commands this of a husband and wife. And so to not have sex, is as sinful as to have sex with someone who is not your spouse. And so, there's that middle. And so as we look at this, what does it look like to cultivate? I'll just put that to you. What does it look like to cultivate intimacy in marriage?
Yeah, I mean, for every couple, I think it starts off with talking about it, just sitting down, uninterrupted, and just talking. I mean, maybe for a lot of couples, it starts with, how often do you think about sex?
Yeah.
What do you think? Like, what are and then you can get into the conversations about what the other person enjoys, what they don't enjoy, because the beauty of sex is, and matter of fact, Chris is talking about this one, is it's an opportunity to serve one another in a
Absolutely.
beautiful way. Like, it isn't just getting gratified and then moving on, but it's the ability to serve the other person in the most intimate possible way that two human beings can. And
Yeah.
a lot of times, like everything, hearing from the person what they actually enjoy and meeting them there, and And if there's things that they're not comfortable with, then stay away from that.
Yeah.
But I think, but open, comfortable dialogue and just hearing your spouse's needs and desires is a really key to cultivating intimacy.
That's so good, James. I think that, what's lost is just the conversation, and that sex really designed by God is to have this intimate moment of closeness. And when we experience it the way that God intended, we feel that closeness in a way that we don't with anybody else. And those are special moments and special times and a special gift that God has given. And so what does it look like to cultivate? Again, God has created each of us uniquely and different. Like we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And in that fearfulness and wonderfulness of being made, God has created us with sex drives. And what does it look like to be intimate? And what does it look like to be romantic? In fact, in premarital counseling, I always ask the question, what does romance look like to you? And I have them answer right there. And then I ask them the question of, what does friendship look like for you? Because the reality is before you were a lover, right, you were a friend. And so what does it look like to bring together the loves of the Bible, which is like, the agape love, the unconditional love, the Philadelphia, the brotherly love. And then you have, the erotic love, the sexual love. And really a healthy marriage has all three of those. Mm-hmm. And we're so good about talking really about the first two. I think, what does it look like to be a friend? There's an expectation of unconditional love in marriage. But then when it comes to the erotic love of marriage, oftentimes we are a bit sheepish to even enter into that conversation. And so I think your words of encouraging people just to talk about intimacy is really fantastic. So, well, in wrapping this podcast up, it's been really fun talking about this subject, and I'm sure that we can again. We did want to give a couple of resources before we, if you're interested in this, if you're interested in knowing what the Bible has to say, or even the way that Christians handle sex, some of the great books out there. One would be a book called Sexual Intimacy by Dr. William Cottrell. That would be one that I would encourage people to look up. One that I just recently read was The Great Sex Rescue, which is actually sex from a women's perspective. Really, really great resource. For you, James, is there any resources out there that you would encourage people to?
No, nothing really comes to mind.
All right.
I was going to say something snarky like a movie, but no, I'm not going to even go.
All right. Good filter. Great filter there. Well, it's been fun hanging with you today, and hopefully this has been helpful to everyone who's listened, and we would encourage you to check out the series Sex Talk that we're doing at Crossroads. You can find that at crossroadsabc.com, or you can catch it on YouTube. Just look up Crossroads ABC there, and you can check the sermons out there as well. So I think that's it. Any last words, James?
Nope. Good stuff, Matt.
All right. We'll see you around.
Thank you for listening to Collision. This podcast is a production of Crossroads Church in Thornton, Colorado. For more excellent content, please visit crossroadsabc.com.